The coastal air in Carmel by the Sea carried the kind of quiet that only exists when the ocean breathes slowly, and the world seems to pause with it. Late afternoon sun glinted off shop windows and old brick buildings, casting long shadows that stretched like tired arms across the sidewalk. Tourists wandered with ice cream cones and cameras, but most locals moved with purpose, familiar with the rhythm of the place, respectful of its history. And in the heart of it all, the town prepared to honor one of its own, Clint Eastwood. Inside the modest theater on Ocean Avenue, crew members scurried about adjusting lights, testing microphones, and smoothing out red carpet wrinkles that refused to lie flat. It was the opening night of a small but meaningful film festival, one that celebrated not just movies but the people behind them. This year's tribute was dedicated to Eastwood, not just as a Hollywood legend, but as a neighbor, a mayor, a jazz lover, and a man who'd quietly shaped this community for over half a century. Backstage, away from the buzz, Eastwood stood near a dressing room door, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn slacks. At 94, his frame was lean but steady, his eyes still sharp beneath the brim of a simple cap. He didn't ask for special treatment, never had. When a young stagehand offered him a chair, he shook his head with a faint smile. "I've stood through worse," he said, voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. The kid laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke or a fact. With Eastwood, it was usually both. Meanwhile, across town, a reporter named Elena Ruiz double-checked her notes in a rented sedan parked outside a coffee shop. She'd flown in from Chicago just that morning, landing with a backpack, a voice recorder, and a mission. Her editor had been clear: get something real, something that cuts through the myth. Elena had built a name for herself by asking the questions others avoided, especially when it came to public figures whose legacies were wrapped in flags, guns, and old-school ideals. She respected Eastwood's craft, sure, but she also saw the contradictions. The man who played righteous lawman on screen had made headlines for offhand political remarks that felt out of step with the times. To her, this tribute wasn't just a celebration, it was an opening. She'd spent the flight drafting questions in her notebook, sharpening them like pencils. Not to trap him, she told herself, but to press past the polished answers. She wanted to know how someone so celebrated for individualism could ignore the systems that kept so many people from ever getting a fair shot. How could his films champion lone heroes while real communities struggled for basic support? These weren't just interview questions, they were personal. She'd grown up watching her mother work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, and no amount of pull yourself up by your bootstraps speeches had ever paid the rent. Now, sitting in the car with the engine off, she took a slow breath. The ocean breeze drifted through her open window, carrying the scent of salt and eucalyptus. For a moment, she let herself imagine a different kind of conversation, one where Eastwood didn't fall back on cliches, where he actually listened. But she shook the thought away. Experience had taught her that icons rarely surprised you. They performed. Inside the theater, the audience began to fill the seats. Film students, longtime residents, a few curious tourists who'd seen the posters. The air hummed with anticipation, not the loud kind, but the warm, respectful kind that comes when people gather to honor something they genuinely care about. When Eastwood finally walked on stage, there was no fanfare, no dramatic music. He simply stepped into the light, nodded to the crowd, and said, "Thanks for having me." That was it. No grand speech, no rehearsed gratitude. Just a man showing up. The tribute played. Clips from Unforgiven, $1 Million Baby, Gran Torino, even early episodes of Rawhide. Each scene reminded the room why he'd endured. Not because he was flashy, but because he felt real. Even in fiction, there was honesty in the way he held silence, in the way his characters carried their regrets like worn coats. After the screening, a short Q&A was scheduled. Elena sat near the front, notebook open, pen ready. She watched as others asked gentle questions about favorite roles, working with certain actors, memories of Carmel in the old days. Eastwood answered each with the same calm, sometimes cracking a dry joke that made the room chuckle like a family at dinner. Then came her turn. She raised her hand. The moderator, recognizing her press badge, nodded. Elena stood, heart thudding just a little faster than usual. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, voice clear but not sharp. "Your work often celebrates self-reliance, the lone figure who fixes things when the system fails. But for a lot of people, the system isn't just broken. It never worked for them in the first place. How do you reconcile that ideal with the reality so many face today? A hush fell over the room. You could hear the faint hum of the projector cooling down in the back. Some people glanced at each other. Others kept their eyes fixed on Eastwood, waiting. He didn't look annoyed. He didn't sigh or roll his eyes. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering not just the question but the person behind it. Then he said, "You know, when I was starting out, I slept in my car more nights than I care to count. Had a duffel bag, a toothbrush, and hoped that didn't always pan out." He paused, letting the image settle. "Nobody handed me a map, but I also didn't expect the world to owe me one." Elena opened her mouth to respond, but he wasn't finished. "What I've learned," he continued, "is that dignity doesn't come from waiting for someone to fix things for you, or from pretending you don't need help. It comes from showing up, doing your part, and leaving things a little better than you found them. That's not politics. That's just being a person." The room stayed quiet for a beat longer, then broke into soft applause. Not the kind that cheers a performance, but the kind that honors truth. Later, as the crowd filtered out and the lights dimmed, Elena lingered near the exit. She replayed his words in her head, not as sound bites, but as something more human. She hadn't gotten the confrontation she'd prepared for. Instead, she'd gotten something harder to pin down, and far more interesting. Outside, the Pacific stretched endlessly under a fading sky. Eastwood stood alone on the theater steps, hands in his pockets again, gazing at the water. He didn't notice her watching. And maybe that was the point. Some people don't perform for the cameras. They just live and let their lives speak. The night after the tribute, the reporter couldn't sleep. She lay in her rented room above a quiet bookstore, the ocean's distant rhythm tapping against the window like a soft reminder that the world kept turning, even when your thoughts wouldn't settle. Her recorder sat on the nightstand, still holding Eastwood's voice. Calm, unhurried, almost gentle. It wasn't what she'd expected. She'd come ready for defensiveness, maybe even arrogance. Instead, she'd walked away with something that felt more like an invitation. She replayed the exchange in her head. Not just his words, but the way he'd looked at her. Not like she was an enemy, but like she was someone worth talking to. That unnerved her more than any sharp comeback could have, because now she had a choice. Frame the moment as a missed opportunity to expose him, or dig deeper into what he'd actually said. The first option would please her editor. The second might cost her the kind of viral headline they wanted. But it also felt truer. By morning, she'd made up her mind. She wouldn't write the story she'd planned. Not yet. First, she needed to understand the man behind the myth. Not the political symbol, not the Hollywood icon, but the person who'd lived in this town for 60 years, who still walked to the same cafe every Sunday, who'd once quietly paid for a local teacher's medical bills after overhearing her worry in line at the post office. Those weren't rumors. She'd heard them from two different people already, both speaking in hushed, reverent tones, as if sharing a secret they didn't want spoiled by publicity. She spent the day wandering Carmel, talking to shopkeepers, bartenders, librarians. No one gave her a polished quote. Instead, they told small stories. How he'd fixed a neighbor's fence after a storm without being asked. How he'd shown up at a high school film club meeting just because a kid had written him a letter. How he never made a show of any of it. "He doesn't like fuss," said the owner of the hardware store, wiping his hands on a rag. "Says actions speak louder than speeches." And honestly, he's right. Meanwhile, Eastwood was back to his routine. He rose early, made coffee in the same chipped pot he'd used for decades, and sat on his porch with the newspaper. The tribute had been nice, but he wasn't one for fanfare. What stayed with him wasn't the applause, it was the young reporter's question. Not because it was hostile, but because it was honest. She wasn't trying to trap him. She was trying to understand. And that, he thought, was rare. He remembered his own early interviews, how journalists used to treat him like a prop, a cowboy cut out to stand beside their narratives. Over time, he'd learned to say less, to let silence do the work. But last night, something had shifted. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was seeing how divided everything had become. Or maybe it was just that he'd grown tired of letting others define what he stood for. That afternoon, he drove his old pickup to the community center on Junipero Street, the one he'd helped fund in the 90s after a fire destroyed the original building. He didn't go inside. He just parked across the street and watched kids stream out after a film workshop, laughing, arguing over who got to hold the camera next. He smiled to himself. That's what mattered. Not headlines, not hot takes. Real people doing real things. Back at her laptop, the reporter typed and deleted again. She wanted to capture the tension between image and reality, the gap between the Eastwood of political memes and the man who showed up to town council meetings long after the cameras left. But how do you write about quiet decency without making it sound boring? That was the challenge. Drama sells. Conflict grabs attention. But what if the real story wasn't in the clash but in the calm after it? She decided to start with the moment he paused before answering her question. Not the words themselves, but the space between them. That pause said more than any slogan ever could. It said, "I'm listening." In a world where everyone's shouting, that kind of silence was revolutionary. She wrote about how he didn't raise his voice, didn't smirk, didn't pivot to attack. He just responded, like two people talking, not two sides battling. And in that exchange, something unexpected happened. The audience leaned in, not to pick a team, but to hear what might come next. As she wrote, she realized she wasn't just covering an event. She was tracing a different kind of courage, the kind that doesn't need a spotlight. The kind that shows up, does the work, and walks away without needing credit. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't trend on social media, but it lasted. And maybe, just maybe, it was the only thing that ever really changed anything. Later that evening, she walked down to the beach, notebook in hand. The sun was setting in streaks of orange and purple, painting the waves in gold. She thought about her mother again, how she'd never waited for a hero to save her, but had built a life anyway, brick by brick, with tired hands and stubborn hope. Maybe that's what Eastwood meant by dignity, not standing alone on a hill, but showing up for your life even when it's hard. She didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to manufacture them. Sometimes the most honest story isn't the one with the loudest ending, but the one that leaves room for the reader to think, to feel, to wonder. And as the tide rolled in, washing away footprints in the sand, she knew what she had to write. Not a takedown, not a tribute, just a conversation, one that might, if she got it right, remind people that even in the loudest times there's power in listening and in being heard. The reporter sat at her desk long after midnight, the glow of her laptop the only light in the room. Outside, Carmel slept under a blanket of stars, the ocean whispering against the shore like it had for centuries. But inside, her mind raced. She'd written 3 different openings for her piece and deleted them all. Each one felt either too soft, like she was letting him off the hook, or too sharp, slipping back into the kind of performative journalism she'd promised herself she'd moved past. She wanted to be fair. Not neutral, not polite, but fair. That meant showing the full picture, not just the parts that fit a narrative. And the truth was messy. Eastwood had said things over the years that stung, offhand remarks that sounded dismissive of people's real struggles. She couldn't ignore that. But she also couldn't ignore what she'd seen with her own eyes. The way the barista at the corner cafe lit up when she mentioned his name, how the old man at the post office chuckled and said, "He still mails his own letters, you know." No assistant, no fuss. It was that tension, the gap between the public record and the private reality, that kept her awake. Meanwhile, across town, Eastwood sat alone in his study, a glass of water on the desk, a stack of old scripts beside him. He wasn't thinking about the reporter or the article she might write. He was thinking about time, how it slips through your fingers like sand. No matter how tightly you hold on, he'd lived long enough to see his own words twisted, his intentions flattened into slogans, his films reduced to political props. It used to bother him. Now it just made him tired. He remembered a conversation he'd had decades ago with a young actor who'd asked, "How do you deal with people misunderstanding you?" He'd answered, "You don't, you just keep doing the work." At the time, it felt like wisdom. Now it felt like surrender. But maybe surrender wasn't the right word. Maybe it was something quieter, acceptance. You can't control how people see you. All you can control is what you do when no one's watching. And for him, that had always been enough. Back in her room, the reporter finally stopped trying to write the perfect piece. Instead, she opened a new document and just started talking. To herself, to the reader, to the ghost of the conversation she'd had with Eastwood. She wrote about how strange it felt to come in with armor and leave feeling seen, not judged, not lectured, just met, as one person to another. She described the way he'd looked at her, not like she was a threat, but like she was someone worth understanding. That kind of attention was rare. In her line of work, interviews often felt like duels. Who could land the sharper point? Who could walk away looking smarter? But this hadn't been like that. It had been more like two people standing on opposite sides of a river, each holding a rope, testing whether it could hold. She typed slowly, choosing words like stones for a path, simple, solid, meant to carry someone forward without tripping them up. She didn't call him a hero. She didn't call him outdated. She called him human. And in doing so, she found herself sounding more human too. The next morning, she walked to the community center Eastwood had mentioned in passing during a follow-up chat with a local librarian. It wasn't grand, just a low brick building with peeling paint and a basketball hoop missing one net. Inside, kids were editing short films on donated laptops, laughing over bloopers, arguing about music choices. A retired teacher named Helen ran the program. She'd known Eastwood since the 80s. He doesn't like to talk about it, Helen said, stirring a pot of soup in the tiny kitchen. But he's been funding this place since the beginning, not with big checks and press releases, just steady support. Every year like clockwork. Why? The reporter asked. Helen smiled. Because he believes stories matter. Especially the ones kids tell about their own lives. He says if you give someone a camera and let them speak, you're giving them dignity. That word again, dignity. It kept showing up like a thread running through everything, not as a political idea, but as a daily practice, showing up, listening, giving space. Later, sitting on a bench outside the center, the reporter watched a group of teenagers film a scene on the sidewalk. One of them kept flubbing his lines, getting frustrated. His friend just clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Try it again. We've got time." Something about that small moment hit her hard. It wasn't dramatic. It wouldn't go viral. But it was real. And maybe that's what Eastwood had been trying to say all along. Not that systems don't matter, but that people matter more. That change doesn't always come from grand speeches or sweeping policies. Sometimes it starts with one person choosing to be decent when no one's watching. She thought about her original question, the one she'd asked on stage. Had she been wrong to ask it? No, the issues were real. But maybe she'd been wrong about what an answer could look like. She'd expected a debate. Instead, she got a reflection. And in that reflection, she saw herself not just as a journalist, but as a person who also wanted to be heard, to be understood, to matter. By the time she returned to her room, the sun was low in the sky. She opened her draft and began to rewrite, not to prove a point, but to share a moment. She wrote about the pause before his answer, the way the room held its breath, the way his voice softened, not to persuade, but to connect. She didn't have a neat conclusion. She didn't claim he'd won or that she'd changed her mind. Life wasn't that simple. But she did say this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone surprise you. And as she saved the file, she realized she wasn't just writing about Eastwood anymore. She was writing about what happens when we stop seeing people as symbols and start seeing them as neighbors, as fellow travelers, as flawed and trying and human as we are. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the cypress trees along the street. Somewhere in town, an old man closed his study door and walked out into the evening, hands in his pockets, heading toward the sound of the sea. And for the first time in a long time, the reporter felt like she was part of something bigger than a story, something quiet, real, and worth telling. The article went live on a Tuesday morning, just as the fog was lifting off the Monterey Peninsula. The reporter didn't send a link to her editor right away. She waited, not out of fear, but because she needed a moment to let it exist in the world without her hovering over it like a parent at a school play. She'd written something honest, not perfect, not flawless, but true to what she'd seen and felt. And that kind of writing, she'd learned, either lands softly or gets lost in the noise. There was no middle ground. By noon, her phone started buzzing, not with angry emails or panicked calls from the newsroom, but with messages from strangers, teachers, veterans, film students, even a retired firefighter from Salinas, who said the piece made them think. One woman wrote, "I've spent years dismissing him because of a soundbite from 2012. I forgot he's also the man who quietly helped rebuild our community center after the floods." Another said, "Thank you for showing that conversations don't have to be battles." Her editor finally called. "It's not what we expected," he said after a long pause. "But people are reading it. Really reading it. Comments are thoughtful. That's rare." She smiled, not because she'd won, but because the piece had done what she'd hoped. It opened a door instead of slamming one shut. Meanwhile, Eastwood heard about the article from his barber, who read it aloud while trimming his hair. "Says you're not what folks think," the barber chuckled, snipping near his ear. "Guess you fooled him again." Eastwood just grunted. He didn't ask for a link. He didn't need to. He'd lived long enough to know that most stories about him missed the point, but every once in a while someone got close. And when they did, he preferred to let it stand without comment. Praise could be as distorting as criticism. But later that week, something unexpected happened. The reporter received a small envelope in the mail, no return address, just her name and the name of her rented room, handwritten in a shaky but steady script. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. On it, in blue ink, were 4 lines. "Thanks for seeing the person, not the poster. Most folks only see the shadow. You looked at the man. C.E." She held the note for a long time, not saying a word. It wasn't an endorsement. It wasn't a defense. It was just acknowledgement. And in a world full of noise, that felt like a gift. She didn't post it online, didn't quote it in a follow-up. She tucked it into the back of her notebook where it would stay, a quiet reminder that sometimes the most meaningful exchanges happen off the record. A few days later, she decided to visit the old fire station on the edge of town, the one that had burned down during the dry summer of 2020. She'd heard Eastwood had helped with the rebuild, not just with money but with time. She found the retired firefighter tending to a vegetable garden behind the new building. He wore a faded cap and moved slowly, but his hands were strong, calloused from decades of work. He showed up one morning with a toolbox. The man said, kneeling to pull a weed, didn't say much, just asked where to start. We worked side by side for 3 days, him hammering, me wiring. Never mentioned it to anyone. I only found out he'd also covered the cost of new hoses when the chief told me months later. "Why do you think he did it?" she asked. The man stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Because he believes in showing up. Not for credit. Not for clout. Just because it needed doing." He looked at her, eyes clear and steady. "You don't fix a town with speeches. You fix it with hands." Those words stayed with her as she walked back through the quiet streets. She thought about how easy it is to reduce people to their worst moments or their loudest quotes, how the internet loves to flatten complex lives into memes, villains or saints, anything but human beings who change, stumble, grow, and sometimes surprise you. She realized her own bias had been part of that machine. She'd come ready to dissect a symbol, not meet a person, and the irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to expose someone else's blind spots, she'd nearly missed her own. That evening, she sat on the beach again, notebook open, but this time she wasn't writing for an audience. She was writing for herself, about how rare it is to be truly seen, and how even rarer it is to see someone else clearly, without the filter of your own expectations. She thought about the kids at the community center, filming their lives with shaky cameras and big dreams, about the librarian who remembered Eastwood reading to schoolchildren in the 90s, about the firefighter's garden, rows of tomatoes and peppers growing where ash once fell. These weren't grand gestures. They were just life, the kind that happens when people choose kindness over convenience, presence over performance. And maybe that was the real story, not the clash of ideologies, but the quiet persistence of decency. Not the headline, but the footnote. Not the moment on stage, but the 1,000 moments off it. Back in Chicago, her editor asked if she'd consider turning the piece into a series, Profiles in Quiet Courage or something like that. She laughed. "Let's not turn it into a brand," she said. "Some things lose their power when you package them." He understood, or at least he pretended to, but she knew the truth. Once you start chasing meaning, it slips away. Meaning finds you when you're busy doing something else, like listening, or helping, or simply showing up. A week before she was set to leave Carmel, she stopped by the local cinema for a late screening of a student short film. The theater was nearly empty, just a handful of people scattered in the dark. She took a seat near the back. As the lights dimmed, she noticed an older man sitting alone in the last row, cap pulled low, hands resting on his knees. He didn't look around, didn't check his phone, just watched the screen like it mattered. She didn't approach him, didn't wave or call out. But when the credits rolled and the lights came up, their eyes met for just a second. He gave a small nod, not of approval, not of agreement, but of recognition. Like two travelers passing on a trail, acknowledging they'd both walked a long way. She nodded back. And in that silent exchange, nothing was solved. No great debate was settled. No political lines were redrawn. But something shifted just slightly inside her. She walked out into the cool night air feeling lighter, not because she had answers, but because she'd stopped needing everything to be a fight. The ocean breathed, the stars blinked, and somewhere in the quiet a story continued, not with a bang but with a whisper. Months passed. The article faded from headlines, as all articles do, swallowed by the endless scroll of newer outrage, fresher drama, louder voices. But in quieter corners, book clubs in Portland, film classrooms in Austin, late-night conversations over kitchen tables, it lingered. Not because it was perfect, but because it felt honest. People didn't quote it like scripture. They just remembered how it made them feel. Like maybe, just maybe, it was still possible to talk across divides without turning people into enemies. The reporter returned to her city, but Carmel stayed with her, not as a place, but as a question. What if more of us chose curiosity over certainty? What if we listened not to reply, but to understand? She didn't become an activist or a pundit. She kept doing her job, but differently. She asked fewer gotcha questions and more open ones. She spent more time in neighborhoods than in press rooms. And when she wrote, she tried to leave space for doubt, for nuance, for the messy truth that most people are neither heroes nor villains, just trying to get by with whatever light they have. Back in California, Eastwood kept living his life the same way he always had. He walked the same streets, drank coffee at the same counter, showed up at the same jazz club on Thursday nights. He never mentioned the article in interviews, never used it to prove a point. To him, it wasn't about being vindicated. It was about being seen as a whole person, not a caricature. And that, he figured, was enough. Then, one rainy afternoon in Monterey, a small film screening was held at a community arts space, a student project from a local college. The film was rough around the edges, shot on borrowed equipment, but full of heart. It told the story of a retired fisherman teaching his granddaughter to mend nets, not because she'd use them, but because the act itself carried memory, patience, and love. The reporter had come down for the weekend, invited by a friend who taught at the school. She arrived early, shaking rain from her coat, and took a seat near the back. The room filled slowly, students, professors, a few locals drawn by word of mouth. And then near the very last row, an older man slipped in quietly. Cap pulled low, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He didn't draw attention, didn't greet anyone. Just sat, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes on the screen. She recognized him right away. Her breath caught just for a second. Not because she was starstruck, but because it felt like the story had come full circle. Not with fanfare, but with stillness. The film played. There were no explosions, no dramatic music. Just the sound of waves, the creak of wood, the soft murmur of conversation between two generations. When it ended, the room stayed quiet for a beat, then broke into warm, unhurried applause. Afterward, people milled about, chatting with the young filmmakers, offering congratulations and questions. The reporter lingered near the door, unsure whether to approach. She didn't want to intrude. But as the crowd thinned, their eyes met, just for a moment. He gave a small nod. Not a smile, not a wave. Just a quiet acknowledgement, like two people who'd shared something real and didn't need to explain it. She nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Later, walking back to her car through the drizzle, she thought about how most stories end with a bang, a victory, a revelation, a grand gesture. But real life rarely works that way. Real change is slow. Real understanding is quiet. It doesn't happen in debates or viral clips. It happens in pauses, in nods, in the space between what we assume and what we're willing to see. She also thought about how easy it is to reduce people to a single moment, their worst tweet, their most controversial quote, their political label. But humans aren't algorithms. We're contradictions. We're capable of both stubbornness and grace, pride and humility, silence and surprising depth. Eastwood had never claimed to have all the answers. He'd just shown up, done his work, and let his actions speak when words failed. And maybe that was the lesson. Not that one man was right or wrong, but that dignity lives in the everyday choices we make when no one's watching. Back home, she kept writing. Not to change the world, but to reflect it honestly. She covered protests and policy, yes, but also the woman who ran a free meal program out of her garage, the teenager who started a mental health podcast after losing a friend, the retired mechanic who taught coding to kids on weekends. She called it the quiet work. Stories about people building bridges, not burning them. Her editor worried it wouldn't get clicks. But readers kept coming back. Not for outrage, but for hope. Not the shiny, packaged kind, but the real kind, the kind that grows in soil watered by effort and care. And every so often, she'd get a note from someone saying, "Your piece reminded me of my grandfather." Or, "I showed this to my dad, and we actually talked for once." That was enough. As for Eastwood, he never read those notes. He didn't follow the metrics or the mentions. He just kept living, gardening, directing small passion projects, showing up for friends, saying little but meaning much. Years later, long after both had aged further, someone would ask the reporter what really happened that night in Carmel. "Did he change your mind?" They'd wonder. She'd always answer the same way. "He didn't change my mind. He changed how I listen." Because that's what stayed with her, not his politics, not his fame, but the way he held space for a question without turning it into a weapon. In a world that rewards performance, he chose presence. And in doing so, he reminded her, and anyone paying attention, that the most powerful thing you can offer another person is your full attention. The story didn't end with a moral. It didn't need one. It ended the way real stories do, with two people walking away, carrying something small but lasting, a moment of connection in a world that often forgets how to connect. And sometimes that's enough to change everything.